Okay, so we're back in the studio today, and we decided to film kind of a part 2 of our conversation from last week, just because we kind of felt like there was so much more to touch on, and we didn't have enough time. So we invited Makayla back, and listen, we heard you. We understand. You wanted to see her on camera, so we put a camera on her, okay? So, hey, Makayla.
Hello.
So we're just going to pick up on our conversation from last week all about what God says about sex. So, Makayla, we were kind of talking after the episode a little bit, and we were saying how there was just some things that we felt like we could go deeper on with this conversation, and that like we just, thought were really important for people to take with them as they walk away from this episode. So talk to me a little bit about some of those things you were mentioning in our conversation.
Yeah, so I felt like one thing that we should have mentioned and that I'm excited to mention today is just the driving home the point that God is really a father figure. And what I mean by that is I feel like a lot of the misconceptions of Christianity and our relationship with God and just God's existence in general is that it's too oppressive. I think our culture wants to convince us that it's very oppressive and that in order to, be happy and feel fulfilled, that you have a certain liberation with sexual freedom as a very big one in our culture. And so to anyone who's young or who's watching this, I just would love to press home that idea that God is really our Father and he knows us more deeply than we know ourselves and that anyone else knows us, and that he loves us so much, and that's why he's put these stipulations in the Bible for us to protect us and not to harm us. And that's just something that I feel very passionately about because I've dealt with consequences of things that I've done before accepting Jesus into my life, and I understand now that it was all out of protection and out of love that he puts these in the Bible for us and not to oppress us.
Yeah, 100%. I think we live in this culture where it's it's not just that whole there's got to be freedom in it, but it's that narrative of you got to test run it. You got to see if it's going to work out, because if you don't want to be stuck with that, or those kind of narratives that come across. And I think you bring up a really good point about talking about God's protection of us, because I don't think a lot of times we really think about the long-term consequences and effect that sometimes when we step out of what God's design is for sex, that can happen in our lives, whether it's shame, regret, whether it's insecurities, whether it's long-term intimacy issues with that person that you end up marrying and that you want to share your life with. And we don't really talk about that. We don't focus on that. We kind of just focus on the here and now and caving into those desires. And I do believe it's really essential that we think about those things and process those things and look at it through the lens of when God created the world and created humanity, he had a very intricate design in mind from the beginning. And I think sometimes we think that oh, well, he wasn't thinking long term, or he's just saying this to be oppressive or whatever kind of verb or adjective you want to put in there. But the reality is he's thought through all of this from the beginning. He knows all. And so I think we got to kind of lean into that a little bit more as believers.
No, I totally agree. It's funny that you mention about the culture's thought process through all of it, saying oh, test run it and all of this. I was watching a movie on Netflix the other night, and it was just so casually brought up, she's going through grief and she's going through a breakup or whatever, and her sister's oh, you just need to get on Tinder, you just need to get that out of you and lead it out of your system and blah blah blah. And it's put in front of us so casually. But I was listening to a podcast this morning, and it was really just going back into Genesis and talking about the creation of Adam and Eve and how their bond and their relationship within marriage was not just physical, but it's spiritual. So sex is not just a physical act, but it's a spiritual act. It's something that's bonding you to another human being. And for our culture to try and convince us that it's such a fleeting, meaningless thing, it's crazy because it is not.
Yeah, 100%. You know, I heard it, a pastor who does a Q&A quite often on his Instagram. He said that like there's actually more freedom in sex when you're married than when you're not. And I thought that was really an interesting point that maybe we'll dive deeper into in a part 3. But, you know, it's just kind of one of those things that we don't actually think about. Like, we always circle back to, like, what we can't do, why we can't do it, you know. I always think about how, like, as a kid, you always want to, like, teeter that line. Like, I don't know about you guys, but, like, whenever someone says you can't do something, you're like, I want to do that. Because you don't understand. But, like, it's everything that we have in our life. Like, you know, whether you have kids or not, you were a kid once and people put boundaries on you. They put it on you for a reason. Parents put boundaries on you to protect you so you don't feel hurt and harm in those moments. And, you know, God our Father, he does the same thing for us. Makayla, I do think, you know, we should talk a little bit more about someone who's maybe dealing with sexual shame or a sexual past and they're not sure how to navigate it. Maybe they think they're like stuck in that a little bit. You know, I always like to reiterate, like on almost every one of these single chairs that we do, regardless of the topic, is that there's always healing and forgiveness and freedom in Jesus. And so, you know, just driving that point home, I think, like, what encouragement do you have for people in those situations?
Yeah, well, we touched on it a little bit last time where Jesus talks to the woman who was caught in infidelity, and he doesn't condemn her when everybody else wants to. And that is the perfect picture of Jesus. He opens his arms to us no matter like what our past is, no matter what we've done, and there is healing and there is freedom in Christ. And that is one of the consequences, right, of like sex before marriage or outside of the standards that God has put on us, is that we can deal with shame and we can deal with regret later, but there is healing found in just coming to Jesus and like laying it at the cross and opening your heart to him, being vulnerable. But also I would say like being vulnerable with others, like having this conversation right here and like being able to talk to other believers and like brothers and sisters in Christ, like to know that not only are you not alone, but also that there is hope on the other side.
Right.
Like vulnerability is so important when it comes to intimacy. And think about like if you are with somebody who you're not married to and maybe it's like a situationship is what the kids say.
Situationships. We've all had those too.
Yeah, but there's not a security in that, right?
No, not at all.
And so if there's not a security in that, there's really not a freedom in that, because you aren't sure if that person, they don't have a commitment to you. You might feel like you're very committed with somebody, but there's nothing really holding them there, even if they say there is. Because feelings do change, and love is not just a feeling. Love is a choice. And when you're married, you choose to wake up and love that person every day. And so when you're able to experience intimacy in marriage, it's definitely a more freedom, like you said, because you have that security. You're within those boundaries that God has placed to protect both you and your partner, and your heart's in it. So I feel like that just is a much better experience because you know that you're safe.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a really beautiful point about the knowing what the true love is, and I think that ultimately, just to like circle back on everything that we've talked about in these conversations and almost every conversation we've ever had here at Everyday Theology, is that like that true love is only found in Christ and demonstrated by Christ. And so when you meet someone who knows that love and experiences that love and walks in that love, you're going to experience Jesus through them as well. And so I think that's just a really kind of cool lens and framework to look at things through. I think Makayla just like took my spot here, which is great. I think we should do that. What about you guys? As we've been talking about this conversation and processing through this over the past couple weeks, what are some of your thoughts on it? And let us know, how do you like having a guest sit in studio with us? Let us know in the comments below, and we can't wait to see you on another episode of Everyday Theology. Thanks for watching Everyday Theology. For more content like this, be sure to hit the subscribe button.